Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So today I have a special device to show off today. This thing is called the Pandora 3D 8001. And this is basically like a standalone arcade box. Now, it kind of comes in this little suitcase package here, and it's pretty heavy. This thing is made out of metal, and it's like 7.5 pounds, I think, or something like that. But as you can see here, it's set up here for your 8 arcade buttons, as well as the arcade stick, which you would put in right here, and then a couple other function buttons that we'll go over as well. Now, it does have a battery inside of it, or you at least can put some batteries inside of it if you want to buy some. Now, the Pandora arcade systems are kind of a household name at this point. They've been known and associated with being like very cheap arcade boxes. You can get them as cheap as like $25 to $30, and this one's quite a bit more expensive than that. And I kind of have a love and hate relationship with this thing altogether. The whole Pandora thing is super confusing. It's really hard to know what to jump into. And so I kind of jumped into that top tier first to at least see like the maximum potential of one of these things. And it's pretty good. It can actually play up to like PSP, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast. And so in this video, we'll do a performance test and see everything that it can do. And we'll also put that into the context of how much it costs and whether or not this is the best place to spend your money. And as always, I'll try to add a little bit of a personal touch to everything along the way. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. Alright, so let's start with the specs. Now, the thing about these Pandora boxes is that it's actually kind of hard to tell what kind of hardware they're running. And that's because there's just not a lot of information out there, or it's poorly translated. But according to its website, it's running a quad-core ARM Cortex-A9 with a clock speed of 2 GHz. It also has a Mali 450 GPU and 1 GB of RAM. In terms of storage, we have 4 GB internal as well as a 64 GB SD card. And the card is already preloaded with all of the games you're going to see on this video. In terms of display, it's an IPS LCD panel with a 1280 by 720 resolution at a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. In terms of connectivity, it has HDMI in and HDMI out, VGA out, as well as 2 USB ports that can be used for controllers. And the asking price is $225, and that's not cheap. Now, there are other buying options available with this board. For example, if you wanted to just buy the arcade board itself, no controls or display, you can get it for about $75. And on top of that, you could just buy a board that includes the controllers but no display, so you would plug it into a TV or a monitor, and that'll be about $100, $110. So this one's kind of like the whole shebang, like it's everything all in one. You don't have to do anything else other than plug it in and start playing. So my approach with this video is I'm only going to focus on this one model here, the one that comes with all the controller hookups as well as the LCD panel. But I'll leave links to the other options from this same AliExpress store in the video description below. Okay, let's get to an unboxing. Now this thing came in a pretty big box, so big that I really couldn't capture the whole thing in my video. But it does come with an HDMI cable as well as a power outlet and the power brick. The book itself is fairly rudimentary, but it does show some different hookup options. And it does come with a couple extra buttons and other things. Okay, let's have a look inside now. Now, first impression, the design on this is very minimalist, especially compared to the typical Pandora game setup. Usually these boxes are like very gaudy and colorful. In terms of buttons, these are pretty good. They have a convex shape to them, kind of like a Sanwa button. They're definitely not genuine, but they do feel better than something like on an arcade 1-up machine. You have 2 rows of menu buttons. The center menu buttons here are for things like start and coin and select and things like that. And the one on the top left here is just for control configurations for the screen itself. That's why there's 2 different on and off buttons. The metal itself has a little bit of grit to it. We'll take a closer look at that here in a second. And here's a look at the arcade stick itself. It's obviously a ball top, and it feels relatively cheap. But of course, this is probably easy to replace. So here's a closer look at that metal. As you can see, it has some good grit to it. But the thing I don't like about it is that the printed on design is not very well done. And it looks like it's been spray painted or something like that, and it just doesn't look very good. In fact, it looks kind of blurry. And for something that costs this much, it's a little bit disappointing to have such a bad design. In general, just the imperfections on this make it look like it came from like a metal shop class, not necessarily from something you'd pay for. But yeah, I mean, the thing overall is nice and sturdy. Like I said, it's about 7.5 pounds altogether. It's got a lot of heft to it. In fact, it's so big and heavy that I don't really think it would be good as a portable device. I just can't imagine myself taking this over to a friend's house. It's just kind of big and heavy. Now it is somewhat portable. In fact, it does have a space for batteries. And I'm not really sure what size batteries these are because a AA battery does not fit in here, but it does have that same shape. And so my best guess is that it uses these batteries here, the 18650 batteries that are usually used in high-powered flashlights. But unfortunately, I couldn't find any information online about what batteries to use. And so just due to the fact that you have to figure out what batteries are going to work on this, and this thing is pretty heavy, I don't think it's going to be a great portable solution. Also on the bottom, we have one heat vent as well as the hole here for the joystick. On the right side, we have an additional vent as well as the VGA out port. And I'm not quite sure what the white button does. Maybe it turns off the VGA, who knows. On the back, we have the power input, an HDMI out port as well as an HDMI in port. Audio jack, volume control, settings buttons, and then 2 USB ports. These are going to be for your first and second player ports. And then on the left side, we have another heat vent. Up front, we have one speaker hole, and that's it. So yeah, that's the exterior of this device. Let's go ahead and turn it on and see what it's like. First, let's get rid of my face by taking off this screen protector. And now we're ready to power it up. Now the interface on this has been around for a long time now. It's called the Pandora's Box operating system. And first thing I noticed is that having the volume wheel on the back of the device is a little bit awkward. Either way, this is how the interface works. You can go and scroll through all the games, or you can go into category, and then by going left and right, you can switch between the different platforms. Things like Nintendo 64, Super Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, Sega Dreamcast, and so on. And like I said before, all of these games were preloaded onto this device. And most of these systems have a lot of games, but things like Dreamcast, they only have 4 listed on here. And some of these translations are also poorly done. For example, Marvel vs. Capcom is called Cartoon Hero vs. Capcom 2. This is a common mistranslation that I've seen across other Pandora-style interfaces. Okay, so let's boot up a game. I'm going to try King of Fighters 2003 using the Final Burn Neo core. And getting into games is super simple. You just press the A button and they will start right up. And in terms of settings, you really don't have anything to work with. There's no frames per second option or the ability to change the aspect ratio on the fly. And so yeah, while the game plays just fine, having it at a 16:9 aspect ratio just feels a little bit weird, especially since this is supposed to be showing at a 4:3 aspect ratio. And across the board, all of the landscape arcade games had the same problem. And getting it back into the games menu, super easy. All you have to do is press the pause button and then select exit game. And it exits super fast too. Now to get into the settings, you have to press that setting buttons on the back here. And just like with the volume wheel, it's a little bit awkwardly placed. So you basically just have to move your hand back there, feel for the button, and then press it. And so these are the options you have within these settings, and there's not a lot here. For example, there's a coin setting, and I thought, okay, this just means I can turn on free play. But what that actually means is that it sets up a coin setting to navigate the menu. So for example, if you wanted to charge people to use your Pandora's games, that's how you would set it up. And so many of these options are not very applicable to a home use case. The image optimization does have the ability to add scan lines as well as a scale to X filter, and I found that neither of those are worth using. Now, if you go into the game settings itself, it does allow you to do things like edit your games list or delete your games from the device. There's also a game market, and you may have seen this in other Pandora's Box style things like the Retroid Pocket 2. But unfortunately, there's no option within the settings to turn on Wi-Fi, so I wasn't able to figure out how to get onto this market to download new games if I had wanted to. Now let's talk about aspect ratio. For the most part, everything is going to show in 16:9, which is great if you don't mind that, but personally I like to show things in an original 4:3 aspect ratio. And so this is where you would use those top left menu buttons. And unfortunately, these are almost all in Chinese, but it is pretty easy to navigate through, and then there is an option here to change the aspect ratio from 16:9 to 4:3. And so if you're willing to go into the menu and kind of navigate around a little bit in Chinese, you can find a way to play this in 4:3. And so once you have this set to 4:3, it actually looks pretty good. That being said, there is some sort of bilinear filter that's being applied right here, and so everything looks a little bit soft and muddy. And unfortunately, I couldn't find a way to get rid of this bilinear filter. You're just kind of stuck with this soft image. Now the other thing to note is that when you change things to 4:3, it's going to affect even the game menu itself, so now everything is going to look squished. And so you kind of have to make a choice. Do you want to navigate everything in 4:3 and then have the games look nice and proper, or are you going to want to change back and forth? No matter what, neither choice is going to be perfect. You're either going to have issues navigating through the menus, or you'll have games that are 16:9. There's no in between, at least within these settings. And moving back and forth is not quite as easy as just the press of one button. For example, this is the absolute fastest I can go to change it from 16:9 to 4:3 and vice versa, so it does take a few seconds. On top of that, the left and right function keys on that menu up there are swapped. So you have to remember to press left for right and right for left, and that's just a little bit annoying too. So for the rest of this video, I'm actually going to keep everything at 16:9 just so I don't have to fiddle with the settings every time. So let's go through and try out a couple systems. The one I was most interested in is Dreamcast. Because of all the systems, I feel like this one might be one of the hardest to run. And actually Dreamcast runs really well on this. So for example, it automatically scales to 4:3, and the speed seems pretty good, at least very close to full speed. You do get some audio crackling here and there, and the emulation is not perfect. For example, you can see the characters have some vertical lines around them, but otherwise this is a pretty enjoyable experience, a lot better than I thought it would be. And I think just overall the emulation is imperfect on this core, whatever they're using as the emulator. For example, you can see with my main character's hair, like her bangs are really bright, but the rest of her is not. And what's weird is that in some levels the shadowing is just perfect. For example, this one here when I fight Hayabusa. So let's try this game here. This is VR Soldier Group 3. Now this also looks suspiciously like Virtua Fighter 3 TB, but no judgments here. And just like with the other games, this one runs nice and smooth. So in terms of Dreamcast, at least with the 4 games that are on here, the harder to run ones are actually pretty good. So let's shift back over to arcade since this is the bread and butter of the system. Here is Street Fighter Zero. Now overall, I was having an okay time pulling off some moves on this, but it didn't feel quite as crisp as I was thinking it would using an arcade stick. I could definitely pull off some moves, but sometimes it felt like I definitely had to be a little bit comically large with my Hadoukens and things like that. Overall, it just didn't feel like a perfect arcade experience when it came to fighting games. And Mortal Kombat has its own share of frustrations. For example, the buttons are incorrectly mapped, and I had a really hard time pulling off moves in this one too. For example, doing a fatality, which is something I should be able to do in my sleep, didn't work at all. And that's kind of frustrating. So let's take a look inside and see what we're working with in terms of components. It's super easy to deconstruct this. It's just a couple screws in the top, and then you just kind of wedge something in there and lift it open. Okay, so this is what we're working with here, and as you can see with the joystick, it is using a circle gate here. And like it or love it, a circle gate is pretty good for arcade games, but personally I prefer octagonal gates because that allows me to feel a click, click, click every time I do a Hadouken, and unfortunately with this one you don't really feel it. But it does look like they're using a standard set of buttons and joystick here. So theoretically, you could go in and update these controls if you'd like, if you wanted to have better buttons or a different gate. And here's the main board here. You can see the little CPU fan. And I think this is the Wi-Fi antenna here, which is ironic given the fact that I can't figure out a way in the settings to turn on Wi-Fi in the first place. But anyway, yeah, this is what it looks like on the inside. On the bottom right here is the little battery compartment. And here's a look at the board itself. It looks like it was built in November of this past year. So it's a relatively recent build. But one of the unique things I saw is that they hot glued the SD card in. So I don't know what that means. Are they just trying to keep you from using the SD card and adding your own games? I'm not really sure. At least for this video, I didn't feel comfortable pulling this apart just because I didn't want to break anything. But I'll probably take a stab at this later on. I'll save that for a different video. But yeah, when it comes to arcade games, it's not the worst in the world. In fact, there's quite a lot of choice in here. The main thing is just that there's no rhyme or reason to the order. Nothing's in alphabetical order, and they're not sorted by favorites or anything else like that. And given the fact that there are 8,000 games on here, finding your favorite game might not be as simple as you would think. But more on that later. I want to show a little bit more gameplay off before we get into the navigation aspect. Now, surprisingly, many of the vertical-oriented games will actually play at the correct aspect ratio, so in that sense, if you want to play vertical shoot-'em-ups, you're actually kind of in luck. Like, these look pretty good. Of course, you're going to have big black bars on the left and right, but otherwise, I think it's a good experience. The Super Nintendo library is pretty good on this. I think there's a couple hundred games altogether on here. And so you have a mixture of role-playing games, fighting games, and even your platformers too. That being said, the game library is not perfect. For example, several of the games that you may want to play are actually in Japanese. And some of your favorites might not be in here at all. But overall, the game speed is good on this. Every single Super Nintendo game I tried played at full speed. So moving over to Nintendo 64, this one played similarly well. In fact, it was pretty impressive how well it played. And like I've mentioned before, there's no frames per second option on here, so I can't actually tell you if this is running at full speed. But I can say that these games played at what felt like full speed to me. In fact, they were quite fun to play. Of course, you're probably going to want to limit yourself to games that work well with a joystick, things like racing games and fighting games. But I would say in a nutshell, Nintendo 64 is entirely playable. Now there are some issues with emulation, for example the background flickering in and out in Killer Instinct Gold. And on top of that, I could only get 2 buttons to actually work on this game, and that was just like my 2 jab buttons. And so sure, yeah, I beat Maya in this part, but I basically just hit her 1,000 times with a bunch of tiny little hits. And so literally death by 1,000 cuts. But yeah, overall, if you want to play things like Mario Kart 64 or even Super Mario 64, these are actually pretty enjoyable. You know, the fact that these use an analog control input and then you're using a joystick, it actually is a pretty good fit. And in addition to save states, this does have the ability to use in-game saves. For example, you can see here that I'm able to resume my save game when I start up Mario 64 again. Okay, so now let's try out PSP. This one has a surprisingly large game library, and I was kind of excited about this one because the games run natively in 16:9, which means that you don't have to worry about aspect ratio or scaling or anything else like that. And it turns out that these PSP games run really well. I got a little bit of audio crackling here and there, but the fighting games in particular felt really good. Same thing with Metal Slug on the PSP, it's actually a really nice experience. There's a few simple platformers on here as well if you want to try those out, and again, these look pretty good at their native aspect ratio. But it turns out that I enjoyed playing the racing games the most. For example, Ridge Racer on this was really fun. Unfortunately, it has like the arcade version of Ridge Racer, which means that you have that timer going every time you're playing. And to me, that's just a little bit more stress than I want in my life, but all the same, it's a fun experience. And using an arcade stick with Ridge Racer is actually pretty fun. Given the fact that this is an arcade-style racer, the arcade stick is a good fit. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about Game Boy Advance, and unfortunately this system suffers on this machine. And that's because by default it runs at 16:9, which is going to make everything look a little bit squashed. But then if you change it to 4:3, everything's going to look a little bit squished. And so there's no perfect resolution to play your 3x2 games like Game Boy Advance on this machine. And the scaling on this is just about terrible. Like, it's really blurry looking and just not very fun. So if you're looking for a Game Boy Advance setup, this is not going to be a good fit. So now let's talk about some of the other issues that I had with the navigation. For example, if I wanted to add Metroid Zero Mission here, which is called Galactic Soldier Zero Mission, to my favorites, there's no button that allows you to do that. There's literally zero option as you're navigating through these games to just quickly say, I want to make this one of my favorites so it's easier to find next time. Instead, you just have to scroll through hundreds, if not thousands of games to find this one again. And unfortunately, the only way to do this is to go into the game settings section and then scroll through the entire list until you find your game, out of the 8,000 that are available on this menu, and then you can select it as your favorite. And unfortunately, the fastest you can do is go by page, and so it's going to take you something like 10 minutes probably to scroll through all 8,000 games. It takes forever. And as you can imagine, I just don't have the patience to go and scroll through just to find one game to add it to a favorite so that I can maybe find it easier the next time around. And so your only other option is to go into each individual system like Super Nintendo and then scroll down until you find it. For example, if I tried to find Mega Man X, I couldn't find it at all. I tried many times. I even looked for Mega Man 10. I couldn't find that one either. And there is a search category, but again, if you search for the word Mega, it does not come up with Mega Man X. And this could be one of two things. Maybe the game is just not on here, or potentially it's mistranslated and I don't know what they call it. For example, it's probably called something like Super Soldier Catalog Christmas X. Either way, it's just about impossible to find your favorite games unless they are luckily at the top of each of these lists. So overall, this was kind of a frustrating experience. But I'm not ready to give up on this thing yet. Let's talk about a few more things. For example, this can do HDMI out. And hooking up to my monitor, it works pretty well. It actually gets a 1:1 image here. And my assumption here is that it's outputting to 720p, but it might be 1080p, I'm not quite sure. Now you can go into the menu settings and either just turn off the display altogether, or you can set it up like I just did to have it go only to HDMI. And so essentially you could hook it up this way and play it like an arcade stick hooked up to a TV. But I also wanted to try out controllers, so I started with my 8BitDo Xbox controller, and this controller gives an X input signal, so I wanted to see if typical Xbox controllers were going to work with this thing. But plugging it in, it actually did not register at all. So that's unfortunate, but there are other options. For example, I have this B-Top controller here, which gives a D input signal, and plugging this one in, it works just fine. I'll leave a link to this in the video description. So with this one, it actually opens up the possibilities a little bit more. So you could actually just close the device itself, and then all of a sudden you can treat it like a home console. You could just have this plugged in and then navigate and play using the controller itself. And games work just fine on this. In particular, PSP looks really good just because it scales automatically to 16:9. And luckily for PSP, the buttons are correctly mapped as well, X is X and so on. Now in this controller, to get back to the menu, you actually just press the back button and it's lightning fast to get back to the menu. It's actually one of my favorite features. It's very easy to get in and out of the games. They start up and close down super fast. So as you can see here, it starts right up, press the back button, and I'm right back in the menu. Very few systems will run this fast. Now, I didn't show off PlayStation 1 earlier, but it does run just fine on this system, and say we wanted to change this to 4:3 aspect ratio. Well, in the settings, you can change the display to 4:3 aspect ratio, but it won't affect the TV at all. So my guess is that unless you hook this up to a 4:3 display, you're going to be stuck with a 16:9 aspect ratio for everything. And that's unfortunate, especially if you wanted to use this as a home console, you're kind of limited in your output options. So one other thing I should mention to get away from the whole favorites menu is that if you go into the recent section, it'll show all the games you played recently. So as long as you continue to play like the same 10 games over and over again, you'll have easy access to them here. Okay, so wrapping up here, let's talk about what I like and dislike about this device out of the box. So we'll start with what I like. Number one, I like this screen on this device. I like that it's a 720p display, and it has pretty nice viewing angles too, and nice colors and everything else. It's a pretty good display. And overall, I would say this device is plug and play to an extent. I mean, at face value, yes, it is loaded up with 8,000 games, and the navigation is pretty easy to figure out how to move back and forth. And navigating the menus is not hard, and it's easy to jump in and out of the games. Honestly, you don't have to know how emulation works at all in order to start enjoying games right here on this device. And I will say it is solid feeling when you have it like up on your desk, like it does feel like a pretty good and sturdy device. So now let's talk about the things I don't like about this device. Number one, I'm not a big fan of the fact that it doesn't use a circle gate for its joystick. That's just a minor nitpick here, but I prefer to have an octagonal gate. Luckily, it doesn't seem to be too hard to swap those out. Now, going on to some of the bigger things that annoy me about this device, the aspect ratio issues were quite annoying for me, but I'm kind of a stickler when it comes to aspect ratio. And so having to jump in and out of those menus in order to change the aspect ratio while you're navigating versus while you're playing a game, that's just kind of a pain. And I wouldn't call this device portable in any way. You know, it's 7.5 pounds. It's not something you can just slip into a backpack. On top of that, it doesn't seem like it was really meant to be portable in the first place. For example, they didn't ship it with any batteries, and there are no instructions about what batteries to buy in the first place. And so overall, it almost feels like they are discouraging you from making this a portable device. And probably my biggest issue with this thing is the fact that the interface is just kind of a pain to navigate. Many of the games are poorly translated, and it's almost impossible to add anything to your favorites. And there's just some boneheaded moves in here. For example, there's a Wi-Fi antenna inside, and there's no way to actually turn on the Wi-Fi. That being said, given the fact that this is in a 100% metal shell, I don't know if that antenna is actually going to pick up on any signal anyway. And so at the end of the day, this is a device where I'm not really sure where the audience is. I could say that yes, if you want to spend $225 to have instant arcade games, this is an option. And so for people who just don't want to mess around with settings or getting their own games and things like that, this is a viable solution. But that being said, the pain of navigating through the system and just kind of working around all of the poorly configured settings is kind of a nuisance at the end of the day. And so when you spend $225, I feel like you should get something that's of incredible value to you. That's quite a lot of money. On the flip side of the coin, I don't think there's an audience with people who are well established when it comes to arcade gaming or emulation. For $225, you could just buy yourself a mini PC, load up Batocera on it, and you could play games all the way up to GameCube no problem. So for those who are comfortable with adding their own games to a system, for $225 you can get way more bang for your buck. In fact, at $225 you could just grab yourself an Nvidia Shield TV, and you're inching pretty close to an Xbox Series S. So at the end of the day, I'm not really sure who's going to benefit from this device the most. As far as a gimmick and the ability to play arcade games on a desktop, yeah, this thing works just fine. But I would just caution you to know what you're getting yourself into. For example, the aspect ratio might bother you over time, and navigating through or finding your favorite games could also be a pain. Now that being said, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. For example, Team Pandora is one of my favorite YouTube channels, and they've been working for many years on these different Pandora boxes, to the point where they have different software solutions that will allow you to unlock the potential of this machine. And that'll give you the ability to easily add new games, adjust the aspect ratio on the fly, and also correct the button mapping and things like that. And so, let me know in the comments below if you're interested in seeing me do a video on this device later on in the future. Because there's a potential here that I could make it a little bit better. It's probably going to take quite a bit of work, but I'm up for it if you are. So, make your vote count. Let me know in the comments below. Say, hey Russ, get rid of this thing and move on to handheld devices. Or, if you're up for it, just let me know and say, yeah man, I want you to do it. And I'll read all the comments and I'll kind of take that to heart and I'll see if this is going to be worth spending a weekend on. Either way, thanks for watching this video. I appreciate you sticking around for something that might not be a perfect fit for you. Personally, I just have a lot of fun checking out these new devices and seeing if they're going to be a fit for somebody else out there. Either way, thanks for watching, be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming!